Welcome to True.
The Hidden Hands Behind the Stars and Stripes. A Tale of Two Boys and the Birth of a Nation's Symbol. Chapter 1. The Boys of Philadelphia. The summer of 1775 hung heavy over Philadelphia like a wool blanket soaked in humidity. In a cramped alleyway off 2nd Street, two boys sat beneath the awning of a modest tailor's shop, their fingers stained with indigo and madder root dye. Thomas Whitmore, age 12, had the careful hands of someone who'd been threading needles since he could walk. Beside him sat Samuel Harding, 11 years old, whose mind worked faster than his fingers ever could. Thomas was the son of a seamstress who had died of fever 3 winters past. His father, a ship's carpenter, had apprenticed him to master weaver Jonathan Ross when Thomas was barely 9, hoping the trade would keep the boy fed and clothed. Thomas had a gift for it, an eye for color and pattern that made even Master Ross pause and reconsider his own designs. The boy could look at a piece of cloth and see not what it was, but what it could become. Samuel's story was different but no less desperate. His family had arrived from England only 5 years earlier, his father seeking opportunity in the colonies as a printer's assistant, but fever had taken Samuel's mother and infant sister within months of their arrival, and his father had descended into drink and debt. Samuel now lived above the print shop where his father worked, spending his days running errands, setting type, and absorbing everything he saw and heard. He had taught himself to read from the pamphlets and broadsides that passed through the shop, and his mind burned with ideas about liberty, representation, and the rights of common men. The two boys had met by chance the previous autumn. Thomas had been sent to deliver repaired linens to the print shop, and Samuel had been struggling to fold a large sheet of paper printed with a colonial map. Thomas had shown him a technique for crisp corners, and Samuel had shared a meat pie his father's employer had given him. They had been inseparable since, meeting whenever their duties allowed, sharing dreams that seemed too large for their small bodies to contain. On this particular August afternoon, they were not supposed to be in the alley at all. Thomas had completed his morning tasks early, and Samuel had escaped the print shop during the chaos of producing an emergency broadside about the battles at Lexington and Concord. The city buzzed with revolutionary fervor. Every corner hosted men arguing about independence, about loyalty to the crown, about what it meant to be a colonist when your mother country treated you like a wayward child in need of punishment. "They'll need a flag," Samuel said suddenly, his dark eyes fixed on a torn piece of red cloth Thomas was absently folding. "If we're to be a new nation, we'll need our own colors to fly." Thomas looked up from his work. "We have flags. Every colony has its own. But not one flag for all of us together," Samuel insisted. He grabbed a scrap of paper and a piece of charcoal from his pocket. He always carried these tools, ready to capture any thought before it could escape. "Right now, we're 13 separate places. If we're going to fight together, win together, we need something that shows we're one thing, not 13. Thomas considered this. He had seen the various colonial flags, the pine tree of New England, the rattlesnake with its threatening motto, the British Union Jack that still flew over government buildings even as men spoke openly of rebellion. Samuel was right. There was nothing that represented them all, nothing that spoke of unity. "What would it look like?" Thomas asked. His interest piqued. This was the kind of problem he understood: how to create something new from available materials, how to make a design that would be both practical and meaningful. Samuel began sketching rapidly on his paper. "It needs to be simple enough that anyone could recreate it. If you make it too complicated, every ship and every regiment will have a different version." His time in the print shop had taught him about reproducibility, about how designs degraded with each copying unless they were kept straightforward. "It needs to be visible from a distance," Thomas added, thinking of the flags he'd seen on ships in the harbor. "Bold colors, strong contrasts. Red, white, and blue," Samuel said immediately. "Those are the colors people already associate with liberty and defiance. The Sons of Liberty use them in their ribbons and badges." Thomas nodded. These were dyes he knew well, colors that were relatively stable and wouldn't fade too quickly in sun and salt air. "Stripes," he said, his hand moving unconsciously as if he were already sewing. 13 stripes for 13 colonies. Simple, clear, easy to count and verify. "And stars," Samuel added, his charcoal moving faster now. "Not a British symbol, not any European heraldry. Something new. Stars for hope, for guidance, for all those ideas about destiny and providence that the pamphleteers keep writing about." They worked through the afternoon, refining their design, 13 alternating red and white stripes, the number impossible to miss or mistake, a blue canton in the upper corner, and within it, 13 white stars arranged in a circle to show that no colony was above any other, all equal partners in the venture. By the time the church bells rang 4 o'clock, they had their design sketched out. It was bold and simple, meaningful, yet practical. Samuel had even calculated the proportions. The cantons should be large enough to be seen, but not so large as to overwhelm the stripes. The stars should be 5-pointed, easy enough for any seamstress or sailmaker to cut and stitch. "We should make one," Thomas said quietly. "A real one, full-sized." Samuel looked at his friend, understanding the enormity of what he was suggesting. They were boys, children of no account in a city full of important men making important decisions. But they had something those men didn't, a complete vision, a design ready to be realized. "Where would we get the materials?" Samuel asked, always practical, despite his revolutionary ideas. Thomas smiled for the first time that day. "Master Ross has a whole workshop full of cloth. He's gone to New York for a fortnight to meet with suppliers. I'm to mind the shop and complete the orders he left behind. If I work extra hours, I could finish his assignments and have time left over. And if we're caught, then we're caught making a flag," Thomas said with a shrug. "In times like these, who would punish boys for being patriotic?" It was settled. They would create the first true American flag, a banner that would represent not one colony or one cause, but a united vision of 13 separate places choosing to become one nation. Chapter 2. The work begins. Master Ross's shop was a narrow building wedged between a cobbler's and a chandler's establishment. The ground floor held the public workshop, where Ross met with clients, and where his 2 adult journeymen worked on the larger commissioned pieces. But Thomas worked primarily in the back room and the cellar below, where fabrics were stored and where the less skilled but still necessary work of hemming, mending, and preparing materials took place. It was perfect for their purposes. With Ross away, and the journeyman focused on completing a large order of naval pennants, Thomas and Samuel could work in relative privacy during the early morning hours and after the shop closed at dusk. They began 3 days after conceiving the design. Samuel arrived before dawn, slipping through the back entrance, while the city still slept. Thomas had already laid out the materials, a large piece of white wool he'd found in the storage cellar, red cloth left over from a military coat commission, and a beautiful piece of blue wool that had been set aside for a wealthy client's waistcoat, but had been rejected due to a nearly invisible flaw in the weave. "Are you certain we won't be discovered?" Samuel asked, eyeing the expensive blue fabric. "The blue was already written off the ledgers," Thomas assured him. "Master Ross planned to use it for patches and trim, and I'm using scraps and remnants for the red and white, nothing that was meant for a specific commission." They worked by candlelight, Thomas showing Samuel how to cut the fabric along the proper grain to prevent fraying and distortion. The stripes had to be measured precisely. They decided on 13 stripes, each about 6 inches wide, for a total width of 78 inches. The flag would be nearly 6 feet long, large enough to be seen but small enough for 2 boys to construct without arousing too much suspicion. Samuel proved to be a quick learner, though his stitches were nowhere near as neat as Thomas's. "I'm better with ideas than execution," he admitted ruefully, examining his crooked line of stitching. "Then you cut and measure, and I'll sew," Thomas decided. "We'll work faster that way." Their partnership fell into a natural rhythm. Samuel would measure and cut, double-checking each dimension against their drawn plan, while Thomas would pin and stitch the pieces together. They worked mostly in silence, too focused for conversation, but it was a comfortable quiet, the kind that exists between people who trust each other completely. The stripes came together over 4 days of dawn and dusk sessions, red and white alternating, 7 red stripes and 6 white ones. Thomas had decided to start and end with red. It was more visually striking and would better hide the dirt and where any flag would inevitably suffer. The canton proved more challenging. The blue field was simple enough to cut and attach, but the stars required careful planning. Samuel had designed a template, a 5-pointed star, that could be traced and cut from white fabric. But after cutting the first 2 stars, Thomas realized they had a problem. "They're too uniform," he said, examining the precisely cut stars. "They look machine-made, artificial. A flag is supposed to inspire, to seem almost alive. These look dead." Samuel studied the stars with a critical eye. His time examining printed documents had taught him about the balance between precision and character. "You're right," he admitted. "What if we cut them freehand, each one slightly different? Not so different that they look wrong, but enough that they have personality." Thomas nodded and set to work. He cut 13 stars, each one guided by the template, but finished by eye and instinct. When he was done, they were clearly the same design, but each had tiny variations. A point slightly more acute, an angle barely more obtuse. Laid out together, they looked like real stars, like you were seeing them through the ripples of atmospheric distortion. "Perfect," Samuel breathed. Arranging the stars in a circle on the blue canton proved surprisingly difficult. They wanted perfect spacing, equal distance between each star, but the mathematics of placing 13 points evenly around a circle was beyond Samuel's knowledge and Thomas's patience. "We'll do it by eye," Thomas finally decided. "Mark the top center, then place the rest by measuring the spaces between them. It doesn't have to be geometrically perfect. It has to look right." They worked late into the night on this task, pinning and repinning the stars until the arrangement satisfied them both. Thomas's aesthetic sense and Samuel's mathematical approximations combined to create a circle that appeared both natural and intentional. Then came the tedious work of stitching each star onto the blue field. Thomas worked by candlelight, his needle moving in and out of the fabric with practiced precision. He used a tight whip stitch around each star, securing them firmly so they wouldn't pull away under wind stress. Samuel sat nearby, supposedly watching for any signs of the journeyman returning to the shop, but in reality watching Thomas work. There was something mesmerizing about his friend's focus, the way his whole being seemed to pour into the simple act of pushing a needle through cloth. "Do you ever think about what we're doing?" Samuel asked quietly. "Really doing, I mean. We're creating a symbol for something that doesn't exist yet, a nation that hasn't been born." Thomas paused in his stitching, considering the question. "I think about it constantly. Every stitch feels like it matters, like I'm sewing together more than just cloth. What if we're wrong? What if the revolution fails? What if the colonies can't work together? What if—" "Then we'll have tried," Thomas interrupted gently. "We'll have made something beautiful and meaningful, even if it only flies for a short time. That's more than most people can say." They completed the canton on a Saturday night, 2 weeks after beginning the project. The final flag lay spread across the cutting table in the back room, and both boys stood silent, gazing at what they had created. It was magnificent. The stripes gave it motion and energy, even lying flat. The blue canton with its circle of stars provided a focal point, a sense of order and purpose. The colors, red for courage, white for purity, blue for justice and perseverance, worked together in a harmony that neither boy had fully anticipated. "We did it," Samuel whispered. "We made a flag," Thomas agreed, his voice equally quiet. "Now what?" Chapter 3. The Presentation. The question of what to do with the flag consumed both boys over the next several days. They couldn't simply hang it outside Master Ross's shop. Thomas would be dismissed immediately, and possibly arrested for theft of materials. They couldn't present it to any official body. Two boys had no standing to address the Continental Congress or any military authority. Samuel came up with the solution while setting type for a broadside advertising the latest session of the Continental Congress. "We need an intermediary," he said. "Someone respectable who can present the flag as if they commissioned it themselves." "But who would do that?" Thomas asked. "Any adult would either take credit themselves or refuse to be involved with something made by children." Samuel's eyes gleamed with the light of an idea forming. "What about Master Ross? When he returns, we could show him the flag, tell him we made it as a suggestion for what the Continental Army might use. He could then present it to his clients in the military, claim he created it based on general ideas floating around the city." Thomas frowned. "That's asking him to lie." "Is it lying to simplify the truth?" Samuel countered. "He owns the shop. The flag was made in his workshop with his materials. We'd be giving him permission to take credit in exchange for getting the design seen by people who matter." It wasn't ideal, but Thomas couldn't think of a better alternative. They carefully folded the flag and hid it in the cellar storage area, wrapped in undyed muslin, and tucked behind several bolts of ordinary fabric. Then they waited for Master Ross's return. Jonathan Ross returned on a Wednesday morning in early September, exhausted from his travel, but pleased with the new supply arrangements he'd secured in New York. He was a stocky man of 43 years, fair-minded and generally kind to his workers, though he could be sharp-tongued when deadlines approached. Thomas waited until the master had settled back into his routine, then requested a private word after the shop closed for the day. "What is it, boy?" Ross asked, weariness evident in his voice. "If you've broken something, best tell me quickly and be done with it, "I haven't broken anything, sir," Thomas said carefully. "But I have made something I'd like to show you, something I hope might be valuable." Ross's expression shifted from annoyed to curious. He followed Thomas down to the cellar storage area, where Samuel was already waiting, having snuck in through the back entrance as planned. "And who's this?" Ross asked, eyeing Samuel. "Samuel Harding, sir. I helped with the project." Thomas unwrapped the flag and, with Samuel's help, held it up in the lamplight. The effect was immediate and powerful. Even in the dim cellar, the colors seemed to glow, the design radiating purpose and unity. Ross stepped closer, his experienced eye traveling over every stitch and seam. He examined the construction, the choice of materials, the quality of the work. His expression was unreadable. "You made this?" he finally asked. "The two of you?" "Yes, sir," Thomas confirmed. "Over the past 2 weeks, during the early mornings and after shop hours, I used only remnants and rejected materials, nothing that was assigned to any client." "The design?" Ross asked. "Whose idea was this?" "Ours, sir," Samuel spoke up. "We thought that if the colonies are to unite, they need a unified symbol. 13 stripes for the colonies, 13 stars for the same. The circle shows that all are equal partners." Ross continued his examination in silence. Finally, he reached out and ran his finger along one of Thomas's seams, testing the strength of the stitching. "This is exceptional work," he said quietly. "Far better than I would have expected from an apprentice of your age." Thomas felt a surge of pride, but remained silent. "And you," Ross turned to Samuel. "You're the printer's boy, aren't you? I've seen you around the neighborhood." "Yes, sir." "This design, this symbolism, it's clever, sophisticated even. You learned to think this way at the print shop?" "I learned to read there, sir, and to pay attention to what people say they want versus what they truly need." Ross nodded slowly. He walked around the flag, viewing it from different angles. "Do you understand what this represents? Not just the symbolism you intended, but what it means to create a flag for a nation that doesn't yet legally exist. This is treasonous material, boys. Possession of it could see us all arrested." Thomas and Samuel exchanged glances. They had focused so much on the creation and design that they hadn't fully considered the political danger. "But sir," Samuel ventured, "the Continental Congress is already functioning as a government. They're raising an army. Yes, Ross waved his hand dismissively. "I know all that. I'm not arguing with your patriotism or your politics. I'm trying to make you understand the risk involved." He turned back to the flag, and his expression softened slightly. "That said, this is a magnificent piece of work. The design is clear and reproducible. The symbolism is meaningful without being heavy-handed. And the execution, particularly the sewing, is of professional quality." Thomas dared to hope. "Then you think it could be used, sir?" Ross sighed. "I think it deserves to be seen by people who can make that decision. I have clients in the military, contacts in the Congress. I could present this to them, tell them it was created in my workshop." "We would be grateful, sir," Thomas said carefully. "We only want the design to be considered." "And the credit?" Ross asked sharply. "You're willing to let me claim I designed and constructed this?" There was a long pause. Samuel spoke first. "We're boys, sir. Even if we claimed credit, no one would believe us. They'd assume we were fronting for an adult anyway. Better that it be you, someone who can actually get the flag seen and considered, than that it sits hidden in a cellar." Ross studied both boys with a new intensity. "You're wiser than your years suggest," he said finally. "Very well, I'll present this as a design created in my workshop. I won't explicitly claim I designed it personally, but I won't correct anyone who assumes that either. In exchange, Thomas, you'll receive an extra half-day off each week for the remainder of your apprenticeship, and Samuel, I'll pay you a small sum for your contribution to the design work." It wasn't recognition, not really, but it was more than they had expected. They agreed. Chapter 4. The Flag Goes Forth. Master Ross proved to be as good as his word. Within a week, he had arranged a meeting with Colonel William Thompson, who was helping to organize Pennsylvania's Continental Army regiments. Ross presented the flag as an innovative design created in his workshop, suitable for representing the unified colonies. Colonel Thompson was impressed, but non-committal. "It's handsome," he acknowledged, "but these decisions aren't made by colonels. I can pass it up the chain, see if it generates interest at higher levels." And so the flag began its journey through military and political circles. Each person who saw it recognized its effectiveness, but no one wanted to be the person who officially adopted it. The Continental Congress was preoccupied with more pressing matters: raising money, securing arms, organizing the army, debating whether to seek reconciliation with Britain or push for full independence. Thomas and Samuel heard updates occasionally from Master Ross. Always second-hand, always vague, the flag had been seen by this general or that delegate. Someone had suggested modifications. Someone else thought it was too bold. A third person wanted to add more symbols. Weeks turned to months. The fall of 1775 gave way to winter. Washington took command of the Continental Army. The siege of Boston dragged on, and still, the colonies fought under a confusing array of different flags: pine trees and rattlesnakes, British ensigns with modified cantons, impromptu designs created by individual regiments. Thomas threw himself into his work, trying not to think about the flag gathering dust in someone's office or storage room. Samuel continued at the print shop, reading everything he could about the progress of the revolution, about debates over independence, about the philosophical underpinnings of self-governance. They met less frequently now. Thomas's workload had increased as Master Ross took on more military commissions, uniforms, tents, battle flags for individual regiments. Samuel's father had fallen deeper into debt and drink, and the boy spent more time taking on odd jobs to keep them fed and housed. When they did manage to meet, usually on Sunday afternoons, they avoided talking about the flag. It was too painful, too frustrating. They had created something beautiful and meaningful, and it had disappeared into the bureaucratic machinery of revolution. Then, in December, Master Ross received an unexpected visit. Thomas was in the back room, working on hemming a set of officers' sashes, when he heard Ross call for him. He entered the front workshop to find his master speaking with a woman he didn't recognize. She was perhaps 30 years old, respectably dressed, with sharp eyes and capable hands. "Thomas, this is Mistress Elizabeth Clark," Ross said. "She's a seamstress who does work for several military clients. Mistress Clark, this is my apprentice, Thomas Whitmore." Thomas bowed slightly, unsure why he'd been summoned. "Mistress Clark has seen the flag design we submitted to Colonel Thompson," Ross continued. "She has some questions about its construction." Elizabeth Clark smiled at Thomas. "Master Ross tells me you did much of the actual sewing work on the flag. Is that true?" Thomas glanced at Ross, who nodded slightly. "Yes, ma'am. I did all the stitching and assembly." "The stars are particularly well done," Clark said. "The slight variations in their shapes, was that intentional or the result of inexperience?" Thomas bristled slightly at the implication, but kept his voice level. "Intentional, ma'am. Perfectly uniform stars look artificial. I wanted them to seem more natural, more alive." Clark's smile widened. "Exactly right. I've been commissioned to create several flags for a military ceremony, and I wanted to understand the technique. Would you be willing to show me how you constructed the stars?" Thomas looked again at Ross, who nodded. For the next hour, Thomas walked Mistress Clark through the process: how he'd cut the stars freehand from a template, how he'd arranged them in the circle, how he'd stitched them down. She asked intelligent questions, took notes, and examined his work with the eye of a fellow professional. "You have real talent," she told him as she prepared to leave. "Have you considered setting up your own shop when your apprenticeship ends?" "I haven't thought that far ahead, ma'am," Thomas admitted. "Well, you should. There will be plenty of work for skilled hands once this war is over." She turned to Ross. "Thank you for your time, Master Ross. And thank you, Thomas. You've been very helpful." After she left, Ross turned to Thomas with an unreadable expression. "That woman has connections throughout the military and the Congress. If she's interested in the flag design, it means people in power are still considering it." Thomas felt a flicker of hope, quickly suppressed. He'd learned not to get his hopes up. But Mistress Clark's visit proved to be a turning point. Through the winter and into the spring of 1776, the flag design continued to circulate. Variations appeared, some with the stars arranged in rows, some with different numbers of stripes, some with additional symbols or mottos. But the core design that Thomas and Samuel had created remained recognizable in all these iterations. In June 1776, as the Continental Congress moved toward a formal declaration of independence, the question of an official flag became more urgent. The colonies were about to declare themselves a new nation. They needed a national symbol. Multiple designs were considered. Some delegates favored keeping elements of the British ensign, symbolizing continued cultural ties, even as political ties were severed. Others wanted something entirely new. Still others argued that the question of a flag was trivial compared to the monumental task of declaring independence and preparing for the war that would inevitably follow. On June 14, 1777, nearly 2 years after Thomas and Samuel had created their flag, the Continental Congress passed a resolution. Resolved that the flag of the 13 United States be 13 stripes, alternate red and white, that the Union be 13 stars, white in a blue field, representing a new constellation. The resolution was brief, providing no specific pattern for the stars or exact proportions for the design, but it was unmistakably based on the flag that two boys had sewn in a Philadelphia workshop. Thomas heard the news from Master Ross, who had heard it from a client, who had heard it from a delegate. By the time the information reached Thomas, it had passed through so many intermediaries that no one could say for certain whether their original design had been the direct inspiration, or merely one of many similar ideas that had emerged from the revolutionary zeitgeist. "Does it matter?" Ross asked, when Thomas expressed frustration at the uncertainty. "The flag will fly. The design will serve its purpose. Isn't that what you wanted?" It was, and it wasn't. Thomas had wanted the flag to exist, to serve the nation they were trying to build, but he had also wanted recognition, wanted people to know that he and Samuel had created something meaningful. The ambiguity was painful. Samuel, when Thomas finally managed to meet with him to share the news, was more philosophical. "We made a flag," he said simply. "It will fly over a new nation. That's more than most people ever contribute to history." "But no one will know it was us," Thomas protested. "Does that matter?" Samuel asked, echoing Ross's question. "We'll know, and isn't that enough?" Thomas wanted to say no, it wasn't enough, but looking at his friend's face, seeing the genuine peace there, he found he couldn't argue. Perhaps Samuel was right, perhaps the doing was its own reward. Chapter 5. The years pass. The war dragged on. The flag that was based on their design flew over battlefields and government buildings, ships and forts, but it was never officially attributed to any particular designer. Various people claimed credit over the years: seamstresses and flag makers, military officers and politicians. Each had some connection to the flag's development. Each had contributed something to the versions that eventually flew. But the core design, the essential vision of 13 stripes and 13 stars in a circle, belonged to Thomas Whitmore and Samuel Harding, and almost no one knew it. Thomas completed his apprenticeship with Master Ross in 1778 and went to work as a journeyman for a sailmaker. His skill with needle and thread made him valuable in a wartime economy where ships were constantly being built, repaired, and refitted. He made a decent living but no fortune. He married in 1782, a quiet woman named Martha who had been widowed by the war. They had 2 children who survived infancy, both daughters. Samuel's path was more difficult. His father died of liver failure in 1777, leaving Samuel with debts he couldn't hope to pay. He worked as a printer's assistant for several more years before the physical toll of the work, the constant exposure to lead type and toxic inks, damaged his health. By 1783, he was barely able to work, surviving on charity and odd jobs. The 2 friends stayed in touch, meeting when they could, but life had a way of pulling people apart. Thomas's family obligations, Samuel's declining health, the simple demands of daily survival in a young nation still finding its footing, all these conspired to reduce their meetings from weekly to monthly to occasional. In 1790, Thomas received word that Samuel was seriously ill. He left his workshop and went to the tiny room Samuel rented near the docks. He found his friend in a narrow bed, his body wasted, his breathing labored, but Samuel's mind was still sharp, his eyes still bright. "Do you remember," Samuel asked weakly, "that summer we made the flag?" "Of course," Thomas said, pulling a stool close to the bed. "I think about it all the time." "I never told you," Samuel continued, struggling to draw breath, "but that was the happiest time of my life, having a friend who understood, creating something that mattered, believing we could contribute to something larger than ourselves." Thomas felt tears prickling his eyes. "We did contribute. The flag flies, Samuel. Our design flies over the nation." Our design, Samuel repeated, a slight smile crossing his face. No one knows that but us. Does that bother you? Thomas asked. Even now? Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow. Thomas thought he might have fallen asleep, but then he spoke again. No, he said softly, it doesn't bother me. We know. That's enough. Samuel died 3 days later. Thomas was with him at the end, holding his hand, remembering the bright-eyed boy who had seen a piece of red cloth and imagined a symbol for a nation. The funeral was small, a handful of people from the print shop, a few neighbors, Thomas and his wife. Samuel was buried in a pauper's grave in a churchyard on the outskirts of Philadelphia. There was no marker, no memorial. He disappeared from the historical record as if he had never existed. Thomas returned to his work, to his family, to the daily rhythm of life in the new United States. But a part of him remained in that cellar workshop, sewing stars onto blue cloth by candlelight, believing that what they were creating mattered. Chapter 6: The Theft of History. In 1794, Thomas received an invitation that surprised him. Master Ross, now retired and in declining health, wanted to see him. Thomas went to Ross's house on a Sunday afternoon, bringing Martha and his daughters. Ross greeted them warmly, though Thomas was shocked by how much the man had aged. He moved slowly now, his hands twisted with arthritis, his breathing labored, but his mind seemed sharp. After the social pleasantries, after Martha had taken the girls to the garden to let the men talk, Ross fixed Thomas with a serious look. I need to tell you something, he said. Something I should have told you years ago. Thomas waited. You know that flag you and young Samuel made back in '75? The one I presented as coming from my workshop? I remember. There's a woman, a widow named Betsy Ross, no relation to me, different family entirely, who's been telling people she designed and made the first American flag, says she did it in 1776 at the request of George Washington himself. Thomas felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. That's not true. Of course it's not true, Ross said irritably. Washington had nothing to do with the flag's design, and that woman certainly didn't create it, but she's been telling this story to anyone who will listen, and people are starting to believe her. Why haven't you corrected the story? Thomas asked. You know the truth. Ross looked away. I'm not proud of this, boy, but I have to be honest with you now. When I first presented that flag, I let people believe I had designed and made it. It was easier than explaining that 2 boys had done the work, and I profited from that misunderstanding. I got commissions, I got recognition. I built my business on the reputation of being the man who designed the first American flag. Thomas felt anger rising, but kept his voice steady. And now? Now I'm dying, Ross said bluntly. And I find I care more about the truth than about my reputation. You and Samuel created that flag. You designed it, you built it, you did everything except present it to the military authorities. And even that you only allowed me to do because you knew you wouldn't be taken seriously as children. What do you want me to do about it? Thomas asked. Ross pulled a folded document from his coat pocket. I've written an affidavit, a sworn statement describing exactly what happened. How you and Samuel designed and constructed the flag, how I presented it as coming from my workshop, how it circulated through military channels and eventually influenced the flag that Congress adopted. I've signed it and had it witnessed by my lawyer. He handed the document to Thomas. It's yours now. Do with it what you will. Present it to historical societies, to newspapers, to anyone who will listen. Tell the truth about who really created that design. Thomas unfolded the document and read through it carefully. Ross had been thorough, describing every detail he could remember, giving full credit to both boys. It was a powerful testament, and it came from someone who had no reason to lie and every reason to claim credit for himself. Why are you doing this now? Thomas asked quietly. Because Samuel's dead, and you won't live forever, and if I don't act now, the truth will die with us. That Ross woman's story will become the accepted history. And 2 boys who actually did create something remarkable will be forgotten entirely. Thomas folded the document carefully and put it in his own pocket. Thank you, he said. This means more than you know. Ross nodded. I'm sorry I didn't do it sooner. I'm sorry I let you think I would be satisfied with simply knowing the truth. You deserved recognition, both of you, and I denied you that out of my own ambition. We were children, Thomas said, and it was a different time. I understand why you did what you did. That's generous of you, Ross said. More generous than I deserve. Ross died 6 weeks later. Thomas attended the funeral with his family. then went home and carefully stored the affidavit in a wooden box where he kept his important papers. He thought about what to do with it, about how to present the truth to a world that had already accepted a false narrative. But life intervened, as it always does. Work demanded his attention. His daughters grew and married. Martha's health began to fail. The daily demands of existence in a still young nation left little time for historical correction. And there was something else, something that Samuel had understood years earlier. Did it really matter who got credit? The flag flew. It served its purpose. It united a nation and gave people something to rally around, to fight for, to believe in. Wasn't that enough? Thomas told his daughters the story, made sure they knew the truth about their father's contribution to the nation's founding symbol, but he didn't push the matter publicly. The affidavit remained in its box, a private testament to a truth that seemed increasingly irrelevant as the years passed. Chapter 7. The Legend Takes Root. While Thomas lived quietly in Philadelphia, working as a sailmaker and raising his family, the false narrative about the flag's origins grew stronger and more elaborate. Betsy Ross, whose real name was Elizabeth Griscom Ross Ashburn Claypool, she had married 3 times, began telling her story more publicly in the 1790s. According to her account, in late May or early June of 1776, she had received a visit from George Washington, Robert Morris, and George Ross, her first husband's uncle, at her upholstery shop on Arch Street. They showed her a rough sketch of a flag and asked if she could make it. She suggested changing the 6-pointed stars to 5-pointed stars, which she claimed she could cut with a single snip of her scissors, and then proceeded to create the first American flag. The story had everything people wanted: a direct connection to George Washington, a clever woman improving upon men's designs, a creation story for the nation's most important symbol. It didn't matter that there was no documentary evidence supporting any of it, that Washington's meticulous diaries made no mention of such a visit, that the Continental Congress's records showed no involvement by Washington in flag design discussions. People wanted to believe the story, so they did. Thomas heard various versions of the tale over the years. Each time, he felt a mixture of anger and resignation. He had the affidavit from Master Ross, proof of what had really happened, but who would believe him? He was an old sailmaker with a self-serving document, while Betsy Ross was a beloved local figure whose story had been repeated so often it had the weight of accepted fact. In 1810, Thomas's wife Martha died after a long illness. His daughters were married with families of their own. He found himself alone in a small house on the outskirts of Philadelphia, his hands too arthritic now for the fine needlework that had been his livelihood. He survived on a small pension from the sailmaking company where he'd worked for 30 years and on occasional help from his daughters. He spent his days reading, thinking, and remembering. He thought often of Samuel, of that bright boy who had seen the need for a national symbol and had worked to create one. He thought about those weeks in Master Ross's workshop, the careful planning, the precise cutting and sewing, the pride they'd felt when the flag was complete. One afternoon in 1812, as the United States prepared for yet another war with Britain, Thomas made a decision. He retrieved the affidavit from its box, along with some other documents. Receipts from Master Ross's shop that showed Thomas had been working there in 1775, a letter from Samuel that mentioned their special project, some sketches of the flag design in Samuel's handwriting. He took these materials to the offices of the Pennsylvania Historical Society. The clerk who received him was polite, but clearly skeptical of the old man's claims. "Sir, the Betsy Ross story is well established," the clerk explained patiently. "We have multiple accounts from her descendants. You have stories," Thomas interrupted, more forcefully than he'd intended. "I have documents. I have proof." The clerk examined the materials Thomas had brought. The affidavit from Jonathan Ross was impressive, properly witnessed and notarized, but it was also 17 years old. Why hadn't Thomas presented it sooner? "I suppose I didn't think it mattered," Thomas admitted. "But now, seeing the false story spreading, seeing it being treated as history when I know the truth, I had to try." The clerk promised to present Thomas's materials to the Society's board of directors. Thomas left feeling both hopeful and doubtful. He had done what he could. The rest was out of his hands. Weeks passed, then months. Thomas heard nothing from the Historical Society. He wrote to them twice, inquiring about the status of his submission. The first letter went unanswered. The second received a brief reply. "Your materials have been reviewed and will be considered for our archives. Thank you for your contribution." It was a polite dismissal, nothing more. Thomas understood. The Historical Society had no reason to challenge the Betsy Ross story, which had become popular and was good for Philadelphia's reputation. They had every reason to be skeptical of an elderly man's claims, even with documentary evidence. And there was no one to corroborate Thomas's story. Samuel was dead, Jonathan Ross was dead, everyone who had been directly involved was gone. The truth was dying with him, just as Jonathan Ross had feared. Chapter 8. A Daughter's Mission. Thomas died in 1815, at the age of 52, worn out from a lifetime of labor and the lingering effects of a respiratory illness he'd contracted from years of inhaling fiber dust in workshops and ship's holds. His funeral was attended by his 2 daughters, their families, and a handful of his former colleagues from the sailmaking trade. His eldest daughter, Catherine, inherited the wooden box containing the affidavit and the other documents related to the flag's creation. She was 31 years old, married to a schoolteacher named Henry Braxton, and she had 3 children of her own. She had heard her father tell the story of the flag many times, and she believed him completely. Catherine was more educated than her father had been, more confident in her ability to navigate the world of historical institutions and public discourse. She decided to take up her father's cause, to ensure that his contribution, and Samuel Harding's, would not be forgotten. Over the next 5 years, Catherine wrote letters to historical societies, to newspapers, to anyone she thought might be interested in the true story of the flag's creation. She sent copies of the affidavit. She provided context and background. She made her case as forcefully as she knew how. The responses ranged from polite skepticism to outright dismissal. Several historians questioned why she was making these claims now, years after the supposed events. Some suggested that her father had been mistaken or had misremembered. Others simply ignored her letters entirely. The problem was timing and narrative momentum. By 1820, the Betsy Ross story had been circulating for nearly 30 years. It had been printed in several books. It had been repeated in schools. It had become part of Philadelphia's civic identity. Catherine was asking people to discard a beloved story in favor of a less appealing truth, that 2 poor boys had created the flag, that their contribution had been stolen by others seeking credit and recognition. People didn't want to believe that. It was too sad, too unjust. The Betsy Ross story was inspiring and empowering. The true story was a reminder that history often belonged to those with the power to tell it, not to those who actually made it. Catherine's most frustrating encounter came in 1822, when she managed to secure a meeting with a prominent Philadelphia historian named Dr. William Thornton. She brought all her materials, the affidavit, the letters, the sketches, everything that documented her father's claim. Dr. Thornton examined the materials carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and seemed genuinely interested, but at the end of their meeting, he delivered a verdict that crushed Catherine's hopes. "Mrs. Braxton, I believe your father was telling the truth as he understood it," Thornton said carefully. "I believe he and this Harding boy did create a flag very similar to the one eventually adopted by Congress, but I also believe that similar designs were being created by many people during that period. The idea of using stripes and stars was not unique to your father. Betsy Ross may well have created her own version of such a flag, perhaps even before your father did. Multiple people can have the same good idea simultaneously. But my father's affidavit clearly states," Catherine began. "Your father's affidavit states what he remembers and believes," Thornton interrupted gently. "But memory is fallible, especially decades after events. And even if every detail is accurate, it doesn't necessarily disprove other accounts. History is complicated, Mrs. Braxton. It rarely has single authors or simple narratives." It was a sophisticated way of dismissing her claims without calling her father a liar. Catherine understood that she had lost, that no amount of evidence would overcome the established narrative. She continued her efforts for a few more years, but with decreasing energy and hope. In 1827, she packed the box of documents away and told her own children the story, making them promise to preserve the materials even if they couldn't change the historical record. "Your grandfather created something beautiful and important," she told them. "Even if the world doesn't know it, we know it. That has to be enough." Chapter 9. The Century Turns. The documents passed down through Catherine's family for generations. Each keeper of the box heard the story. Each pledged to preserve the truth. Each ultimately failed to change the public narrative. The Betsy Ross legend grew stronger with each passing year, eventually becoming one of America's most cherished founding myths. In 1870, Catherine's grandson, William Braxton, made another attempt to present the evidence to historians. By this time, the Betsy Ross story had been endorsed by several prominent historians and had been taught in schools across the nation. William's claims were dismissed even more quickly than his grandmother's had been. The Betsy Ross account is well established, he was told repeatedly. If your great-grandfather had really designed the flag, surely there would be contemporary documentation, not just a decades later affidavit from someone else. William tried to explain about the boy's age, about the social dynamics that had made direct credit impossible, about Master Ross's deathbed confession, but these explanations sounded like excuses, like the desperate rationalization of someone trying to claim undeserved glory for an ancestor. The bitter irony was that the very circumstances that had prevented Thomas and Samuel from receiving credit in their own time now made it impossible to establish their contribution posthumously. The lack of contemporary documentation, which existed because they had been children without access to official channels, was used as evidence that their contribution never happened. In 1893, William died, and the box passed to his daughter Eleanor. She was a schoolteacher, a suffragist, and a woman of strong convictions. She looked at the documents with fresh eyes, and saw not just a historical injustice, but a broader pattern of how the contributions of ordinary people, especially the young and the poor, were routinely erased from official history. Eleanor wrote an article about her great-great-grandfather's story and submitted it to several journals and magazines. Most didn't respond. Those that did were polite, but firm in their rejection. One editor's response captured the general attitude. While your family's story is touching, we cannot publish claims that contradict established historical fact without extraordinary proof. The Betsy Ross account is supported by multiple sources and has been accepted by serious historians. Your great-great-grandfather's affidavit, while interesting, is insufficient to overturn the established narrative. Eleanor put the article away and focused her energies on causes where she could make a difference: women's suffrage, education reform, workers' rights. She kept the box of documents, kept telling her children the story, but she no longer tried to change the public record. Chapter 10. The Truth Remains. By the mid-20th century, serious historians had largely debunked the Betsy Ross story. Research had shown that there was no contemporary evidence supporting her claim, that George Washington had not been in Philadelphia at the time she claimed to have met with him, that the flag design had evolved over time through multiple contributors, rather than springing fully formed from a single creator. But the myth persisted in popular culture. It was too appealing, too embedded in American consciousness to be easily dislodged. Elementary school children still learned about Betsy Ross and her clever five-pointed stars. Her house in Philadelphia became a tourist attraction, though historians knew it probably wasn't even her actual residence. And somewhere in a suburban house outside Philadelphia, a descendant of Thomas Whitmore kept a wooden box containing documents that told a different story, one that was probably closer to the truth, but lacked the narrative appeal of the accepted myth. In 1976, as America prepared for its bicentennial celebration, Thomas Whitmore's great-great-great-grandson, David Whitmore, made one final attempt to bring the true story to light. He was a history professor himself by this time, teaching at a small college, and he understood both the value of documentary evidence and the challenge of changing established narratives. He wrote a carefully researched article, placing his ancestors' contribution in the broader context of flag design in revolutionary America. He acknowledged that multiple people had contributed ideas, that the final congressional design had drawn from various sources, but he argued convincingly that Thomas Whitmore and Samuel Harding had created one of the earliest and most influential prototypes. The article was published in a small academic journal. It generated brief interest, was cited by a few other scholars, and then faded into the footnotes of history. It changed nothing about how the general public understood the flag's origins. David was disappointed, but not surprised. He had studied enough history to know that myths often mattered more than facts, that people preferred inspiring stories to complicated truths. The Betsy Ross legend endured not because it was true, but because it served a purpose. It gave people a simple, memorable story about the flag's creation, a story with a hero they could admire. The truth was messier. Two poor boys had created something remarkable, and then that creation had been appropriated by adults, modified by committees, diluted by multiple contributors, until its original creators were completely forgotten. It was a story about class, about age, about how power determined who got credit for ideas. It wasn't inspiring, it was depressing. And so the myth won. Epilogue: The Weight of Stars. The wooden box sits now in a climate-controlled archive at a small historical society in Pennsylvania. It was donated by David Whitmore's daughter in 2015, along with a detailed family history explaining its contents. The archivists cataloged it carefully, noting the affidavit from Jonathan Ross, the letters from Samuel Harding, the sketches and documents that told the story of two boys who created an American icon. Occasionally, a researcher examines the materials. The story gets mentioned in a few academic papers, always with caveats and qualifications. According to family tradition, one account suggests, while unverified, the Whitmore documents indicate no one wants to definitively claim that Thomas Whitmore and Samuel Harding designed the American flag. There are too many competing claims, too much uncertainty, too many gaps in the documentary record. And the Betsy Ross story, though largely discredited among serious historians, retains its hold on popular imagination. But sometimes, late at night in the archive's reading room, when a particularly dedicated researcher examines those old documents by the light of a desk lamp, something remarkable happens. The past comes alive. Two boys appear in imagination, sitting in a cellar workshop by candlelight, their heads bent together over sketches and fabric, creating something that would outlast them by centuries. Thomas Whitmore, with his steady hands and artist's eye, cutting stripes and stars with infinite care. Samuel Harding, with his quick mind and revolutionary ideals, shaping symbols into meaning, both of them believing that what they were making mattered, that their contribution would help build something larger than themselves. They were right about that, even if they were wrong about recognition. The flag they designed, or something very close to it, did fly over a new nation. It did inspire soldiers and unite citizens. It did become one of the world's most recognizable symbols. Their vision had been realized, even if their names were forgotten. Perhaps Samuel had been right all along. Perhaps knowing was enough. Perhaps the doing was its own reward. But standing in that archive, looking at the yellowed documents and faded sketches, it's hard not to feel that something was lost. Not just credit for two boys who deserved recognition, but something larger, an understanding of how history actually happens, how ordinary people contribute to extraordinary things, how the official story often obscures the messy, complicated human truth beneath. Thomas Whitmore died in obscurity in 1815, his contribution forgotten by all but his family. Samuel Harding died in poverty in 1790, buried in an unmarked grave. The flag they created flew over a nation that never knew their names. But the stars they cut and stitched with such care still circle in their eternal pattern, 13 points of light representing 13 colonies that chose to become one nation. And though the world may never know who first arranged those stars in that perfect circle, the stars themselves remember. They remember two boys in a Philadelphia workshop, believing that they could help create something that would endure. And they were right.